On the evening of January 23rd, 1897, one of the biggest leaders in organized crime California has ever seen was gunned down as he sat for a shave on the corner of Washington Street in San Francisco. This assassination would touch off a firestorm of violence in the city by the bay. This crime boss had ruled over the entire section of the city known as DuPont Guy, or as we know it today, Chinatown, and his exploits would be every bit the story as those of crime lords that we're more familiar with, like Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, or Meyer Lansky. But due to the fact that he was a Chinese-born national in a state where his own people were used as labor on the railroads, his countrymen would face prejudice, scorn, and a fight with both the state of California and the federal government to expel all Chinese from the United States. His name remained fairly unknown in both the history of the organized crime and also that of California as a state. His story reminds us of parts of our shared history that we don't usually talk about, those parts that we would rather not remember. This is a story of a man with power and wealth, but who created a criminal empire that shakes the very foundation of San Francisco. This is part one of the life and death of Fong Little Pete Ching, criminal overlord of Chinatown and the Tong Wars of the 19th century in San Francisco. Hello and welcome to another episode of California True Crime. I'm Charles and I'll be hosting this evening as we talk about organized crime, opium dens, sing-song girls, Tong Wars, and the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. Tonight I have Sean with me to discuss the case and some of the history behind the places and time periods. Good evening, Sean. How are you?
I'm great.
You ready to talk about a little organized crime in Chinatown?
Yes, I don't think I've ever had the pleasure of being asked that question before, so this is pretty exciting.
I don't think I've ever asked that question either.
Before we jump into tonight's episode, I would like to bring up that we have a Patreon page. If you go to californiatruecrime.com, there's a link there. We're still working on getting all the rewards and everything together, but we do plan to have everything out soon with the rewards. We'd also like to thank Dale and Matt for being Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting the show, and glad to have you here.
Instead of doing an overview of the history and background of the entire city of San Francisco, we're going to focus this time on just a section of town known as Chinatown. But even before that, we're going to do a little background on the Chinese immigration into America and into California specifically. Global trade brought America and China together all the way back in 1784. But it was not until the 1800s that the first Chinese citizen was brought to America for the purposes of learning English. And in 1842, Fong, who was a Chinese juggler, became one of the most famous attractions in America. In 1848, P.T. Barnum, Barnum and Bailey Circus, hired a Chinese woman to be displayed at his famous freak show in New York. And that was the same year that 2 Chinese men and 1 Chinese woman were landing in San Francisco, which was the trading center of the West Coast and actually America's connection to trade with Asia.
So the P.T. Barnum, they had a Chinese woman for a freak show. Did she have a beard? Was there?
No, it was really just to display a Chinese woman.
Wow. Okay.
You'd pay your whatever the rate was, the 15 cents, and the museum was called the Great American Museum, and within that museum they had a freak show, and where you could go and see oddities or, I mean, like what people think of as a freak show. And in that, he would bring attractions that I guess regular people would find entertaining. And part of that was an actual Chinese woman on a stage standing there.
Wow. It's pretty ridiculous.
It is, I think. But given the fact that at the time, Chinese immigration in the United States was almost non-existent,
Mm-hmm.
and especially on the East Coast where people had no concept of what, of an average person in China would look like. It still is incredibly insensitive to think that you're going to spend money to go and stare at somebody.
Yes.
So from these two Chinese men and first Chinese woman in California that landed in San Francisco, soon after they land in California, the population is actually going to swell to 300. By December of 1848, we find these 300 settlers meeting in a restaurant where they choose Salim Woodworth, who is a prominent ex-military officer and a resident of San Francisco, that would speak to the larger white residents on behalf of the Chinese. So this is starting to be like the first kernel of what we know of as Chinatown. So from 1848, we get the initial start, but by 1852, there's 25,000 Chinese residents in California. Most of those are residing within the city proper. So we're, again, talking about San Francisco. Initially, they're welcomed into the state as a source of cheap labor. They were even invited to march in the funeral procession of President Zachary Taylor. And in 1852, the governor of California, John McDougall, even urges the California legislature to start issuing land grants to the Chinese.
That's such a big jump in 4 years, from 300 to 25,000.
Right, and what's interesting, too, is if you look at what's going on in 1848. In 1848, gold's discovered above Sacramento in Sutter's Mill. You have the huge rush, the gold rushes begin in full swing. And people from all over the United States and really all over the world are flocking to San Francisco and to California to look for gold.
Yeah.
And the majority of these 25,000 Chinese are doing the exact same thing.
Okay.
So the other thing I find interesting, too, is the Chinese immigrants are really welcomed into the state. So it's I'm not saying that they didn't face persecution and prejudice, but from a lot of people in power, they were welcomed in. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because of that idea of what's called the model minority. So that idea of they're good workers, they don't cause problems.
And they're cheap labor.
So as long as you're doing your job, you're going to be good.
Right.
And we'll welcome you as the establishment. It's also important to make a distinction between the Chinese that were immigrating to California and some other groups that were coming from the East, like the Irish immigrants and German immigrants, and even other immigrants from other Asian countries. The Chinese, for the most part, are coming here not to live and to make a new life, but they're really coming here just to work and earn money, and then that money would be sent home to provide for their families while they're still here. So eventually, the idea was that these Chinese immigrants would go home to China, where you get Irish immigrants, German immigrants, other Asian immigrants. They're coming to California to stay and build a new life. Mining and construction companies looking for workers would hire Chinese labor, and when the Chinese labor had earned enough money, they would then return to their homes in China. The Chinese saw themselves not as new Americans, but rather they saw themselves as Chinese living in a foreign country. Chinatown could be seen not really as a part of America, but rather as an extension of China itself. When you cross the borders of Chinatown, you are really entering a new country with a whole different set of rules and laws and customs. The problem was that this would lead to a lot of mistrust and misinformation between the Chinese and the white residents of the rest of the city. Soon, through things like the foreign miners tax law, and what that was is that levied a $20 a month tax on foreigners that were engaged in mining, as well as the discrimination and violence that faced a lot of non-whites throughout the state. This would drive these Chinese and immigrant settlers back into communities like Chinatown and San Francisco, where they felt more safe and protected. By 1854, another governor of California, John Bigler, was calling the Chinese coolies in his state address and urged the legislature to ban all further immigration to China. Now, before we go any further, we want to discuss a little bit about the term coolie. It is an incredibly offensive and racist term, and I'm only using it here because it's a quote from his address.
Right.
Originally, the term was used for unskilled indentured labor, and it soon became a pejorative term for unskilled Chinese and Asian immigrants that came to America.
When I started looking up the word, because I was just trying to get more information, I saw that in some countries, for some reason, it's kind of taken on a new form and it's not as derogatory as other places.
Right, and I think early on, even when the term was first coined, I read that it wasn't considered a racist term. I think what happens, though, is like anything, language changes.
Right.
And by the time the governor is using it in his address, it is seen as a direct racial slur against specifically the Chinese.
Yeah. And then there's also a 1983 like Bollywood movie called Coolie.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I haven't seen it, and it's on YouTube if you want to watch it. but it is 2.5 hours long. So it's quite a long movie and especially 1983. I just don't know how well it was probably made.
No, I'm gonna have to check that out. Now, in fact, the Chinese, this big shift in like 2 years between welcoming them in and fighting for land grants to now calling them racist terms and addresses by the governor, it's also going to go so far as the Chinese are going to be blamed for the conditions of the ships that brought them over and the slums that they're forced to live in once they get here, instead of the actual white businessmen and slumlords who are overselling space on ships or not providing safe and sanitary places for rent. And as of 1873, the Chinese actually only own 10 out of 153 buildings and major pieces of property in Chinatown. And it gets worse. In 1904, that number is only 25 pieces of property owned by Chinese out of 316 pieces of property.
So if Chinatown, I guess it's still part of San Francisco, correct?
Yeah, you mean at this time?
Yeah.
Yeah, legally it's part of San Francisco.
Because you were saying they have new laws and rules all by themselves, but who's actually owning these buildings if they're not?
Well, I guess what we would call slumlords.
Okay. Did they already own it before Chinatown was?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So...
And what happens is San Francisco at the time, it's kind of builds up like around a wheel. I mean, if you think of like the first building in San Francisco, everything kind of spirals out from that.
Right.
And Chinatown, these buildings are owned by these white slumlords. And as more people are pouring in there, San Francisco in 1880s and 90s is not much different than San Francisco now. Land is a premium. So instead of allowing the Chinese community to expand, what they're doing is they're pouring more people into the same area.
Okay.
And that causes them to, it's like tenement buildings, they're adding on to it. It's unsafe conditions, it's unsanitary conditions. You're filling a glass with too much water.
Right.
Remember that by 1852, there are 25,000 Chinese living in San Francisco. By this time, a man by the name of Norman Ah Sing, who acts as a kind of mentor and spokesman for the Chinese in their own community, he sets up shop on Sacramento Street between Curie and DuPont. And this is really where the heart of Chinatown and the seed from which everything else is going to grow out of. So we start from the initial 300 people meeting in the restaurant to now, 4 years later, we have a new spokesman. We have somebody connected into the community and a much larger community springing up. At the start, Chinatown was called Little China by the majority of the white residents of San Francisco, but to the Chinese that lived there, it was known as DuPont Gai because it being situated along DuPont Street, with Broadway, Stockton, Montgomery, and Sacramento streets as its borders. And actually, at the time, it was located a few blocks north of where it currently sits, which is the northeastern part of San Francisco. Now, DuPont Gai at the time in the 1850s was bordered by Little Chile, which would later become Sydneytown, and would later still turn into the famous Barbary Coast. All throughout the Bay Area, there were other smaller Chinese communities, but these functioned as satellites of a much larger hub in DuPont Gai. Which had been built near the heart of the city, close to some of the first buildings that were built in the city when it was being founded. Now, this is interesting to me because at least when I've studied immigrant communities and kind of history of California, what you often see is you see immigrant communities situated on the outskirts of town. And San Francisco is interesting because you have an immigrant community smack dab in the middle of town.
Yeah.
But also at this time, it's right next to some really, I guess, dicey neighborhoods. Little Sydney, again, which becomes really famous as the Barbary Coast, which is a really famous San Francisco community for like crime. It's the place you didn't go in after dark.
Right.
Shanghai, sailors getting shanghaied and all the bad stuff you associate with.
Yeah, and I lived in the Bay Area for a couple of years, and it's weird because I never went to Chinatown. I guess there was just no reason that I needed to go, but getting to know all this, it's funny because the only thing I really know about Chinatown is pretty much what I learned from John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China, where it is a white director who even calls it Little China instead of
Right.
Chinatown. But that's all I know. And this was really interesting to learn a lot more.
And I think that's what I really liked about researching this particular case, but then really getting into the history of the area was because I'm the same. I mean, being from Northern California, Chinatown was so exotic, but the times that I, as a kid, went to San Francisco, we did stop in Chinatown, and that was kind of my first experience with Asian culture in general.
Right.
But then also, and I agree, I love that movie a lot.
Yeah.
It's one of my all-time favorite movies. But I think oftentimes that's what people see. They see images in the media, like Big Trouble in Little China, and that's my image as a kid. That's my image of what.
Right, and I think there's Chinatowns portrayed all over the country, such in other movies as Chinatown, or which isn't San Francisco, or where Gizmo is found in Gremlins. You think it's Chinatown, but you don't really know.
And it has that mysterious, they're always portrayed the same way.
Right.
All the signs are in Chinese. It's always mysterious, smoke-filled streets.
Right.
There's always something nefarious happening. And in this case, I think when we talk more about Fong Ching and his rise to power in the criminal underworld, I think what we have to remember too is we're talking about the specific criminals of Chinatown. Not everyone that the vast majority of the people that were living in Chinatown were
here to work.
Here to work. They were just trying to make a living for their families. So I was fascinated with this really because it was a part of our history in California that we don't ever really talk about in our history books. And at the same time, seeing how the rise of organized crime mirrors some of the stories that are a lot more well known, like the mobsters in Chicago, or again, Mickey Cohen in LA.
Right.
So the legend of Fong Little Pete Ching grew out of his unsolved murder. This case is not necessarily straightforward, so the telling of it will be a little bit different as well. First off, I've already told you how this particular story will end, with Fong Ching being killed by an assassin's bullet. His murder will go unsolved for the most part, with many, many wild theories existing even up to this day. There's no real clear evidence pointing to the perpetrators or who may have done this. But that's not the most interesting part of the story. It's really the story of a rise in power of one of the most powerful men in California history that most of us never have even heard of. Now, before we got into this, had you, Sean, ever heard of Fong Ching at all?
Never.
No, me neither. I think for me, that's part of the reason why I'm really excited to do this case to begin with.
Yeah, it's knowing the case now, it's like it's a huge thing, and never ever have I heard this.
Right. And I think when we first started out doing this podcast, one of the things that we had talked about, you, Jessica, and myself, was trying to highlight some of the parts of true crime in California that don't necessarily always get the attention they maybe deserve,
right,
and really highlight some of the history that makes our state unique.
Right.
And I think this case exemplifies that. So the story of the man that the San Francisco Call newspaper called, and I'm quoting, the most famous of local Mongolians, unquote. And again, we're talking about newspapers that are written in 1880s and 1890s. So the term Mongolian was used as a pejorative term against
Do you think it was
all
just
Asians.
Ignorance, not knowing where, like the geography of China?
I think that maybe there might be an element of that, but I also think that it's a white-run newspaper with white writers not bothering to actually learn anything about the people they're writing about. So his story really begins when he's born in 1864 in Kaohsiung, which is about 10 miles south outside of Canton in southern China. Now, Canton's also referred to now as Guangdong. And like many other immigrant communities, there was no shortage of people looking for work and wanted to really help out their families, as well as there's a lot of political unrest that's happening in southern China at this time. So this made the perfect recipe for people looking beyond the borders of their own country for any opportunities, especially economic ones, for residents of southern China that were not part of the upper class or couldn't find any other gainful employment under the rule of an oppressive northern Chinese government. So for our story, that destination is the port of San Francisco in California. Now, Fong Ching was not always a gangster. He will come to California in 1874 when he's 10 years old. Now, it's unclear if he came by himself or with other family members. His mother, however, will remain in China, and he would continue to take care of her, sending home money really for the remainder of his life. It's also, I think it's important to point out now that we are talking about that there are no child labor laws in California at all.
Right.
And there is no national child labor laws until really 1916.
So he's able to do whatever he wants.
Yeah, if you could find a job, somebody will hire you.
Yeah.
So once in San Francisco, he's going to start to earn a living as an errand boy for a shoe factory on Sacramento Street on the southern edge of Chinatown at this time. Now, by all accounts, he was hardworking, and he sent his $10 a month salary home to his family in China to help take care of his mother who still lived near Guangdong. We do want to mention at this point that we're going to talk a lot about money this episode. There's vast amounts of money. So instead of at each time, like for example, he made $10 a month salary, I will link on our California True Crime episode page inflation calendar that you can figure out exactly what it would be like in 2018, what $10 would be. There are a few times when we're talking about huge amounts of money that we will mention that this is how much it would be in 2018. So Fong Ching attends Methodist Chinese Sunday school as well as a grammar school. Now, there are some reports that he even attended a high school, but those I could not find any information on what that high school was or if he actually did attend it. Now, these schools, the Methodist Sunday School and Grammar School, they were specialized in teaching English to Chinese in hopes of converting them to the religion. Now, Fong Ching, by all accounts, became proficient in English very fast. It was then that he joined the Sam Yup Company and became involved in Greater Chinatown politics.
I find it interesting that they would teach English to Chinese in hopes of converting them to a religion. It seems like the Methodist Church had their own intentions. They were like, "Oh, we'll teach you English, but you have to become religious."
And what I read a lot about, especially the Methodist Church and the mission that was kind of bordering Chinatown, was that these Methodists, they would love it if you became Christian and Methodist, but it wasn't the same kind of religious conversion that you'd saw earlier with like the California missions, where it was a forced conversion. It was, please come in, we will teach you English, we'll help minister to the sick and the poor. If you become Christian, great. If you don't, then that's good too. We're just making connections.
Right. I think with the Methodist Church, they've always kind of been in the spotlight with kind of doing interesting things. Like I'm pretty sure it was Idaho or Utah or somewhere like that, where a Methodist pastor, maybe late 90s, married 2 women, and that wasn't legal. Even the first world gay marriage happened in like 2001 in the Netherlands. So they were always like
a little ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they're a different type of church, it seems like. So
right.
Maybe they really intended just to help these people and teach them English.
And I don't think later when we talk about some of the other things that are going on in Chinatown, the Methodist mission becomes a safe haven for a lot of the Chinese immigrants that are looking to escape the persecution from the gangsters and the criminal element, that this becomes kind of a place to go to and a champion for the underclass.
Yeah.
This is a time where we're going to talk about his first real employer in the Chinese community, the Sam Yup Company. So there are 6 companies, or Yu Kun, which is called Company House, and the 6 companies were called the Sam Yup Company, Yuan Wu, Kwang Kao, Ning Yung, Hop Wu, and Yan Wu. Now, these 6 companies, so from here on out, we'll collectively call them the 6 companies, unless there's a specific one we're talking about. Now, they were set up to assist the Chinese that had come to California. In their own words, they were to assist Chinese, minister to the sick, bury the dead, and return the bodies to China. And by bury the dead, I actually mean perform the funeral rites. Originally, these companies were offshoots of companies in Hong Kong that started the trade of finding cheap labor for other companies in other parts of the world. So a lot of times these companies are going to be confused with what we're going to call the fighting tongs. We will talk about those later. Think of that. The tongs is more of a criminal element, but even that word has a lot of different meanings. And I think this starts our first discussion of when we're talking about Chinese history in this time period in California, there's a lot of misconceptions between the predominant white residents of San Francisco and the Chinese. And a lot of it stems from cultural differences and language differences. So these companies, these 6 companies, are not criminal organizations. They were more like a mutual aid and travel society.
So kind of like a labor union.
Yeah, almost like a labor union, and really more of like a cross between a labor union and a tourist board.
Oh, okay.
You know, like come to our city. So the problem was the general public didn't ever really understand that, and they didn't understand what their role would be in Chinese culture. So that's why a lot of times when in newspaper accounts, when they're talking about the mob or the Chinese criminals, they say that in the same breath they say the Chinese 6 companies.
Uh-huh.
So these companies are run by business leaders and scholars who are usually the most educated of the Chinese immigrants. There's no voting or input in the larger membership, which I thought was interesting. That these companies have board of directors, but there's no voting from the general membership. So as a member of the company, I would trust that the organization would be run by people that were smarter than me and that were in a higher position of power. And then as a member, I'm just expected to follow their lead.
Yeah.
They would settle disputes between Chinese members, and they would act as arbiters between outside world and Chinatown. So if I had a problem with a white resident or a resident of San Francisco proper outside of the bounds of Chinatown, I wouldn't go to the authorities. I go to my company. I go to one of the company that I belong to.
So it's like Chinatown's People's Court.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example. It's not legally binding, but it's the person that I'm going to trust to. And again, depending on your age, for me it was always Judge Wapner.
Yeah.
I don't even know who the judge is on.
I don't even know if they. It's just Wapner.
You can't change.
Yeah.
If you don't know who Judge Wapner is, please look it up on YouTube. But again, this is going to lead to a lot of misunderstanding with a larger population, that the companies are trying to subvert the law of San Francisco, and they're really not. They're seeing it as they're protecting their people from being taken advantage of by the larger communities. Now, that's again not to say that there wasn't corruption, that there wasn't some nefarious things being done but the companies at large were here to protect the Chinese immigrants.
Right.
So the one thing that was the hardest for the people on the outside to understand was that of exit visas. So now an exit visa was sold or given by the companies to make sure that no ticket was sold for China to its members unless that person had taken care of all of their debts. So if I'm a Chinese immigrant, I'm going home. Before I went home to China, I had to check out with my company, and they would check all of my debts and make sure that I'm not leaving anything behind.
Right. Nothing they could take home that could make them look bad here.
Right, exactly. Or also, I would not be allowed to skip on any debts either.
Yeah.
So if I owed money to a hotel, I couldn't run up a really big hotel bill and then skip town. Now, if that person was buying the ticket and I refused to pay off my debts, then the companies would even help the local law enforcement to help find me and then prosecute me under general law.
Okay, so then they would go out of their own little area.
If it was a problem they couldn't solve, then
Right.
it went up then to the proper larger authorities. Now, all of the companies grew out of the original Kong Kao company, and this was first company that was organized on Sacramento Street back when we had 300
Right.
immigrants. Each company usually dealt with people from different regions of China. So you would join the company that was set up to help people from your region. So, I guess for us, we would have a California company, and there would be an Idaho company and a Michigan company. So when we're dealing with it, we're only dealing with those companies that know our home, and also, so this is kind of like an immigrant community within an immigrant community.
Right. It's 6 tiny states inside of a tiny area.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a perfect analogy for it. Each company usually dealt with people from different regions of China, and the representatives from each of these companies would then meet in a meeting hall that was called the Meeting Hall of the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom is another term for China that's used by Chinese. Now, this is where any business issues could be dealt with, or personal issues. Anything that needed to be dealt with could be dealt with here, almost like a UN. So, or in your analogy of like the 6 states, this would be like the Congress.
Right.
Now, in fact, the companies even protested the importation of big-footed women. And big-footed women was another name for low-born women that were commonly used for in their terms, quote unquote, immoral purposes, which again is the sex trafficking.
And so like big-footed woman goes like to the bound feet kind of thing, like the opposite of a bound foot woman.
Yeah, exactly. Traditionally, and again, this goes back that in certain time periods in Chinese history, certain dynasties valued the idea of small feet in women. So if you were upper class, you would have your children's your girl children's feet bound, and that was a way of showing like that you were of a certain class. So the term big-footed woman was, well, you're poor.
Right.
And we're going to come back to the sex trafficking that was going on in Chinatown at this time, because it's one of the worst problems to really come out of this section of the town. We'll also link an article on Chinese foot binding on our episodes notes page at californiatruecrime.com. The 6 companies would lose a lot of their power after the Geary Act was passed in 1892. And this was the act that wanted all of the residents of California that were foreign-born to carry a permit to be in the state. This, in effect, was an extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which tried to ban all Chinese immigration into the United States completely.
These 2 acts that were implemented, that it kind of was building up. There was the San Francisco riots of 1877, and it wasn't like, it didn't seem like a riot for much else except the whites wanted Chinese out, and they just fought them. There was 4 deaths and destruction of over $100,000 worth of property at the time. So it was just, there seemed to be a lot of tensions going on at this time.
Another reason I found this case interesting was because it mirrors a lot of stuff we see later on in California history. I mean, we're still seeing it now in California history. We're seeing, protests, discrimination, violence against immigrant communities because they're seen as different, or they're seen as evil, or even the root cause of problems that are going on. The 6 companies told their members to peacefully not register and protest because their civil rights were going to be violated. This would cause a larger backlash against the Chinese residents in California. The protests were not successful, and the 6 companies would begin to lose face with their membership. This was about the same time that the Fighting Tongs were beginning to really take over and become a real power in Chinatown. This would highlight the 50-year fight between the companies and the Fighting Tongs. Fong Ching would soon display a ruthlessness and materialistic streak that would be strong attributes in the eventual criminal empire that he's going to build for himself. He's kind of like an evil Horatio Algiers out of the darker side of DuPont guy.
I have no clue who Horatio Algiers is.
Horatio Algiers was an author in this time period that wrote a lot of books about young boys that moved west and made something out of themselves with, a strong work ethic and like.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of like the evil side. Like, the story that we're going to tell about Fong Ching, he really did work hard to build this empire. The problem is that his empire is built on criminal organizations and the exploitation of the people that he lived near in Chinatown.
Right.
Now, in the Sam Yump company, he's going to act as an interpreter, which would allow him to be privy to all sorts of secrets and schemes that he's then going to turn around and use to benefit himself and allow his power to grow. As interpreter, Fong Ching had interactions with the outside white world, and as he got older, he adopted more mainstream American ways of acting. This would depart from the more traditional Confucian roles that were set up by his community at large. Even though he still dressed in the traditional manner of his countrymen, he was being called Mr. Chinatown by the larger white community that had dealings with leaders in Chinatown. This allowed him to build a power base that had a foot in each world, and would see his rise to power all more quickly because of it.
So it seems like he's kind of adapting or becoming sort of a chameleon he's still wearing his traditional outfits and everything, but he's stepping out into the outside world of Chinatown and just kind of adapting to this white world.
Right, and I think first off, the language had a lot to do with that. The fact that he was fluent in English and Chinese when the majority of immigrants that came to work in the gold fields or work on the railroad didn't speak English, or if they did, it wasn't fluent.
Right.
He's working for one of the most powerful companies of the 6 companies. He's making a name for himself, and he's learning that the real power in Chinatown isn't necessarily in Chinatown. It's the businesses and all the money that's outside of Chinatown that wants to buy stuff. Even though Fong Ching did not take part in the vices that were becoming a part of life in Chinatown, he would build his criminal empire on them. And the 3 vices that ruled Chinatown and that were really the life's blood of the criminal underground were opium, prostitution, or the sex trafficking, also called sing-song girls in Chinatown, and then gambling. So those are the three criminal enterprises that that are going to flourish in this time period. Now, the opium trade in the 19th century has a really complicated history between England and China and the U.S. These are called the Opium Wars in China, and America is going to take part in forcing China to keep its ports open, and that allowed the opium trade to flourish. So that's actually the opium being imported into China. It also causes an epidemic of addiction and dens that spring up everywhere that there's trade with Asia. The Chinese are going to be blamed for this epidemic and the opium dens and the addiction of the people, but it's first the British and then followed by the Americans that fought to allow the trade to continue. Opium is actually imported from India into China, but like I said, the Chinese take the blame for it. And the opium trade in the United States really takes off in 1861 when the ship Ocean Pearl brings 52 boxes of opium to San Francisco shores. And there is a map that we will link on the episodes page of CaliforniaTrueCrime.com that is done by newspaper reporters. That was actually a map of Chinatown with a location of all of the opium dens and houses of ill fame and gambling dens for the neighborhood.
So 52 boxes. Are these like, the boxes you would see on those giant crate kind of styles, and it was just full of opium?
Yeah, and I tried to look up what the poundage was, and I really couldn't find anything. So I'm assuming it like a crate, like a really large Amazon box.
Yeah, where they would always in movies like Indiana Jones or something, they just pop it open with a crowbar and stuff like that.
And then there's at this time the opium is mixed in, processed in kind of a slurry. So it's like a paste.
Okay.
And then this paste would then be lit, and they would the majority of them would be smoked out of pipes. Okay. So this is where you get the term like chasing the dragon, and again, this is fictionalized a lot in Hollywood of the Chinese opium dens. But doing this research, it really opened my eyes to the role that Western Europeans had on proliferating the opium trade. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Chinese try to stop it. They go to war. That's the first opium war with Britain to close their borders to stop the opium trade. Fong Ching was very smart and talented and could have been someone that could have bridged the gap that was ever present between the white residents of San Francisco and the Chinese community, especially the business and political leaders that had no idea how to deal with Chinatown and were constantly at a loss when confronted with the different culture and traditions of the residents of DuPont Guy. Instead, Fong Ching used his power and influence only to increase his own power and wealth and cared not who or what lay in his path. It was this path that would end with a gunman's bullet while sitting in a barber's chair. He was completely amoral and believed that what was good for Fong Ching was good and everything else was considered bad. Now, eventually, Fong Ching is going to save enough money on his own, and that added to a small loan that he takes out on his name alone, which, again, should tell you a little bit about how much he's trusted, even as a young man.
Right.
So he takes his money out, and he uses it to start his own shoe business. Now, the Chinese laborers and shoes have kind of an interesting connection. The Chinese were actually brought in to work at shoe factories as scab labor. So the idea was that they would be brought in to break union laborers in the garment manufacturing industry. And soon, eventually, they're going to take over most of not only the shoe manufacturing, but a lot of the garment industry in San Francisco. And again, there's rampant racism and bigotry for these workers. So Fong Ching's answer to it is starting his own company, I guess.
Right.
Now, by this time, Fong Ching had been working as a broker for the Sam Yup Company. Now, As a broker, he deals in both goods and people, specifically two types of people. The first is manual labor, and the second is prostitutes. Now, I put that in quotes because when we talk about prostitution at this time period, we really are talking about sex trafficking. Now, the first group of people, the manual labor, are Chinese men that are brought into this country to work in the mines, railroads, and construction projects. Now, with the passing of the Geary Act that in effect banned all Chinese immigrants into the United States of America, Fong Ching was able to smuggle these workers into the country for white business owners that were looking to cut corners and drive down costs. Again, he's proving that he's someone who could get things done. The second were Chinese women that were sold into slavery or stolen outright and forced to work in prostitution. Again, the sex traffic trade. Up and down California, as well as being exported into other states. In both of these fields, he excelled and made a lot of money, as well as a lot of influence with powerful people both inside and outside of China.
So it seemed like the Geary Act was more of a front because the people just didn't care. They wanted to save money. They cut corners.
Right, exactly.
And Fong Ching came in and provided that.
Right, and I think even the company itself that publicly says we're here to protect the Chinese workers and we're here to fight against the sex traffic trade, I have a hard time believing that they were completely unaware of Fong Ching's business dealings.
Right.
And again, he's seen as somebody that can get business done regardless of who it hurts. As long as there's money to be made, he's there.
Yeah.
Fong Ching knew how to make a splash and deal with white businessmen and customers, and this would make or break his business. So what he did was he named his new shoe factory F.C. Peters and Company. So the F is for Fong, the C is for Ching, but he intentionally tried to make it not sound Chinese. The San Francisco elite that were in on the joke started calling him Little Pete. This is where we get his moniker, Little Pete.
Right, and I asked you about like Peters, like was that a significant thing? And we couldn't really find anything until that we did see that there was 3 or 4 other shoe companies in the United States that had Peters in its name at the time. So he could have just been going off of maybe a familiarity of Peters Shoe Company. I remember that on the East Coast. They're here too, and
which is really smart. I mean,
yeah.
he's tying himself to known names. Like you said, well, I don't know. I kind of heard of those Peters shoes, and I have one here in town.
Right,
FC Peters. I'll buy shoes from them.
Right. Then people might have thought it was like just like a sub. Like a sister store to the other ones, so it was just familiarity.
Right, exactly. Now, soon this moniker is going to stick, and everybody's going to start calling him Little Pete Ching. Now, I think this has more to do with how he's portrayed in public. So the newspapers that are covering him and will write pages and pages on him will call him Little Pete. He built up his business by selling to both Chinese and whites around the state and beyond. So it's not just a San Francisco business. It's all up and down California into Oregon, Washington, and even East Coast. He's going to employ white accountants and salespeople. And by all accounts that I could find, he pays them top dollar wages for the time. So he's somebody that knows how to do business in both worlds.
Right.
While at the same time, I think understands the bigotry that's rampant and knows how to play it so that he still comes out on top.
Is he paying white people top notch and paying Chinese people less? Did you find that at all?
I didn't find that. Given how much money he spends, and then later when we start talking about his criminal dealings, a lot of the people that work for him in criminal enterprises, as odd as it sounds, all say the same thing, that he really paid good wages.
Okay.
And now whether that's because out of the kindness of his heart, or if I pay you well, you're not going to turn me into the cops. Right. Now, his business is going to grow and expand, and soon he's selling shoes everywhere. And with this business success comes wealth. This was a legitimate business. The shoe business is not a criminal front. In fact, he does keep both things separate for a time. And all by itself, the shoe business would have, in all likelihood, made him rich. And conceivably one of the richest men in San Francisco at the time, especially one of the richest Chinese people in San Francisco. Now, eventually he's going to marry. He marries Chun Li and has 3 children. Now, this also adds to his status in the Chinese community. And even though he was a young man and more Americanized, he would begin to take on a larger presence in the Chinese community as a leader and somebody who people could go to for advice. As a successful business owner with a family and a respected name, he makes himself into someone other Chinese can look up to and then ask for help. What's interesting, I think, is this is in strict opposition to traditional Confucian custom. And that custom says that a younger person, no matter their wealth or their status, always defers to somebody of older age. At the same time, he's publicly gaining power and status. He's also building a lucrative, albeit somewhat less legal business of several gambling dens around Chinatown. Now, the types of gambling that's going on in Chinatown at the time, there's three main games that are being played. And the first is Fan Tan, the second is Pai Gao, and the third is Mahjong. And these are going to be staples of Chinese gambling.
What is Fan Tan?
Fan Tan is a game that's played with tiles. So it's similar to Mahjong. I'm actually... I'll post a link on the episode's notes page on CaliforniaTrueCrime.com. It's complex. I tried reading through it. It falls out of style right around the turn of the century.
Oh, okay.
So it's not something you're going to go into a gambling hall. Even like if you went to a local casino or you go to Reno or Vegas, you wouldn't see Fan Tan usually. You will, however, see Mahjong a lot. That's the game that's played with the tiles, kind of like dominoes. There's lots of apps that you play solitaire using Mahjong tiles, but it's a real cutthroat gambling game.
Okay.
The one that I think most people will be familiar with is Pai Gao.
Right. I've played Pai Gao like in Reno or in Vegas, and I have a couple stories about Pai Gao. So you make two different hands. So if you play it with cards, you make a low hand and a high hand. And they have like these side bets that you can make. So if you get a really good hand in your 5-card hand, you can do a side bet and win some money. And I would never put the bet on. And the dealer lady, I hit something big and I would have made a lot of money. And she actually called me an idiot. And it was pretty awesome. But she wasn't being mean. It was more of a joke. But then my friend Mark, he sat down to play Pai Gao one time, and you can also play it with tiles, which is more like dominoes. I looked up the things, and they have all these odd names. Like there's the tall 7 or the weird 6. But he sits down and puts like $20 down, and they just throw these domino things at him, and he had no clue what was going on, and he just said, "Can you make the hand for me?" And they did, and he won he won $20 and just ran away right away. But yeah, it was really confusing because there's either or at like different places,
and it's really popular. I mean, I think if you see it, most casinos I think we've been to, usually if you sit down and ask, especially if it's not busy, they'll show you how to play the game.
Right. And the odds of it are pretty cool because most of the time you push. So if you sit there long enough, you'll make your money. But it's a pretty fun game because you're not constantly losing. You're pushing and just getting your money back to play another hand.
And of all of the vices that we were talking about, opium, the sex trafficking, and then gambling, it's gambling that's going to stay the longest. Mm-hmm. A lot of writers at the time talk about that is really Chinatown's vice. Well past the 1906 earthquake, even into the 20s and 30s, it's gambling that really sinks its hooks in.
Yeah.
Now, as Fong Ching's power is growing in the criminal world, he's beginning to hire those men that he can trust to do what needs to be done, and that were loyal only to Fong Ching. He would recruit the most violent young men that could be found, and these are the Hu Hao Dois, or hatchet sons, or hatchet men. We'll kind of refer to them as hatchet men from now on. And as the name implies, their preferred weapon of choice is a hatchet. And these guys could be counted on to make sure that a steady stream of tribute in the manner of protection money, gambling, again, money from the sex traffic, and murder is coming in. Now, there are a few terms that we've been using a lot and that we're going to need to do a little bit more explanation of those. And there are three of them, two that we've talked about and one that we will talk about. And those are tongs, hatchetmen, and highbenders. And we're going to start in reverse order. So the term highbender is not really used in California until the 1870s, when Special Officer Delos Woodruff is using it to describe Chinese criminals that were responsible for most of the organized crime that is happening in Chinatown while he's testifying in court. Now, the term was originally used to describe Irish criminals in New York as early as 1806, and it originally meant a kind of confidence man or swindler. Once it's used in California to describe the Chinese criminals, it sticks, and from then on out, it's a way of denoting a high-level Chinese gangster called highbender, or like the Chinese mobsters. I think it's the same kind of term as calling somebody a wise guy.
Okay.
The next term is hatchet men, which we just talked about, the hu hao doi. In Chinese, these types of men were also called hatchet sons. Again, hatchet sons are hatchet men. And they're paid thugs and assassins that criminal organizations would hire as soldiers. So they are named because, again, their signature weapon is a cleaver or hatchet. It was something that was easily grabbed. You could throw it away. It looks like a tool.
Right.
The last term, and probably the most confusing term when we talk about crime in Chinatown in the 1880s and 1890s, is tong. Now, the word grows to mean a criminal organization that specializes in either drugs, gambling, or sex trafficking. However, early on, the term really was more like a community group or labor union. So again, we see this confusion with things like the six companies. Even today, when the word tong is brought up, there's confusion over exactly what it means. And so it requires a little bit more investigation when dealing with that term. Now, in a foreign country, the tong houses were usually places where people from the same hometown or region would gather and to discuss things and where disputes get settled. So again, we can see how similar it is to the early companies, the six companies. It's not until later that the tongs became known as criminal organizations, and that was mostly due to the misinformation that was being circulated in newspapers and government officials who had no real understanding of Chinese culture or the people they were talking about. Now, the tongs as criminal organizations were almost unknown in China. Now, there is organized crime in China in the form of the Triad Society. It was also called the San Hu Hoi, or the Society of Heaven and Earth. The Society of Heaven and Earth was more of a revolutionary organization that the Chinese government took as criminal, but they were fighting against corrupt officials in the government. Mm-hmm. And we see this change from the tongs being, I guess, benevolent societies to really in the 1880s and 1890s being criminal organizations, because for a lot of these young men, and it is young men, I mean, the majority, I think 98% of all immigration into California at the time is young men. They don't have a lot of opportunity for work other than working in the gold fields, other than working on the railroads. And I think these guys see crime paying. It's easier work. It's not backbreaking labor in the fields. And so a lot of these guys that don't have other opportunities, that are living in, not necessarily great neighborhoods, they start to band together and look for an outlet.
Right. I think if you're not getting any opportunities unless you're in jobs where you could die. I mean, working on the railroad or in the mine, the gold mines, it's not a safe job. And you see this more easier opportunity if people are already kind of running it. They give you an opportunity to make money without having to do something. You're young. I mean, if we want to go into frontal lobes, you know, your decision making isn't the greatest at the time. So
no, and you're faced with, again, poverty. Mm-hmm. Bigotry and racism. You're far away from home. You're also far away from a culture that stresses how you behave.
Right. And if you're supposed to be sending money home and you want to look good for that.
Right, exactly.
Be able to live and send more money home.
Right. So we see, and then there's also, I think this other aspect is there's also a huge demand for opium, for gambling, for sex trafficking in not just California, but in other states as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a demand, and these young men see as a way of filling that demand and still making money and not having to go out and actually get a real job.
Right.
Like other types of organized crime, rivalries began between these tongs. The most famous rivalry was between Fong Ching's tong that he started called the Ji Sin Seer Tong, and then against the rival Bo Sin Seer Tong. Now, both the Ji and the Bo in their names are connected to clan names, so affiliated families. Now, violence in Chinatown is becoming more commonplace, and more illegal enterprises are starting, as well as more of these tongs being formed, and everybody's fighting for the same piece of the pie. Don't forget, we're still talking about just Chinatown. The tongs do not operate a whole lot outside of Chinatown proper. Now, the Bo Sin Seer believe that to break down Fong Ching's power, the only way to do that was to kill Little Pete and then take over his business. Now, Fong Ching is going to find out about this, mainly due to the fact that he's completely plugged into the grapevine of Chinatown, as well as having connections outside of the town that would help apprise him of bad things happening. Now, he's often aware of plots and machinations well before they're actually put into place. This time, though, he had to do something to ensure that he was protected because the rival Tong is so powerful. What he does is Fong Ching finds the most deadly of the Hu Hao Doi as a bodyguard, and that person is Lee Chuck. Now, he's going to be Fong Ching's bodyguard almost all the way up until Fong Ching's death. From what I've read, the two of them were close, and Lee Chuck was absolutely utterly loyal to Fong Ching. Now, I don't know whether that's because of being paid really well or the familiar relationship or what, but he's considered by all to be his close companion. Now, on July 23rd, 1886, Detective William Gleanan gets a tip from a confidential source about a plot to kill Lee Chuck. So the idea was if the Beau Sincere Tong could kill Lee Chuck, it's going to make it easier for them to get at Little Pete.
Right.
Now, Detective Gleanan warns Lee Chuck about this, who then tells Fong Ching. I think this is interesting because Fong Ching's response is he goes out and purchases 2 chainmail vests weighing 35 pounds each for himself and his bodyguard. In fact, because Fong Ching is so powerful and so as a symbol for the criminal organizations in Chinatown, that this actually starts a fad amongst other Tong bosses and even company leaders of wearing chainmail shirts underneath their garments as a means to turn an assassin's blade or to stop a bullet.
Was there a chainmail store? Or was this something that he had to get someone to make for him, and then that person kind of started a store?
No, this is actually something that had to be custom made.
Okay, so then it that person who probably made it or other people figured it out, and it kind of became a new fad of the evening wear, and
right.
It was like a new business.
And again, it's chainmail.
Right.
Which does not stop a bullet.
Yeah.
There are a few videos, and we'll link these again on our episodes page of CaliforniaTrueCrime.com. But there are numerous videos on YouTube that you can see of people shooting chainmail, and the bullet goes right through. So I think now we had discussed earlier about the idea that this is under padded clothing, and with the Colt pistols that they're using at the time, it maybe slow down the bullet enough that it.
Right, but then at the same time, it slows down your death because it's not like medicine is still the greatest.
No. So, it also might be like a placebo effect of I feel more comfortable and more confident because I'm walking around town in a chainmail shirt. Yeah. So on July 28th, so the next night, in 1886, Yen Yun, who is a hatchet man for the Beau Sincere Tong, he's actually going to bump into Lee Chuck in an alleyway, and they're going to exchange words and then attack him. So before Yen Yun pulled his pistol, Lee Chuck pulls a gun and guns him down with 5 shots to the body. It was then that Lee Chuck began to run away and was pursued by an officer, J.B. Martin. Now, Officer Martin's interesting because he eventually will be named police chief of San Francisco in 1910. Now, during the chase, Lee stops, turns, and tries to shoot Officer Martin, but the 6th cartridge in his revolver is a dud. Martin collides with Chuck like a tackle and throws him to the ground. Lee Chuck reaches for another pistol that he carried and tries to shoot Officer Martin. It was then that another officer, an Officer Maurice J. Sullivan, tackles Lee and pulls his arm away and then takes the pistol away, and they arrest him and take him into custody. Now, Fong Ching, having worked with both the Chinese criminal community as well as the business community of Chinatown and San Francisco, had dealings with the political community of the greater San Francisco area. Now, he's going to approach policeman Burr Love and Con O'Sullivan in the back room of a saloon at Cleary and Stockton Streets. He offers them each $400. Now, that's $11,335 in 2018 to help Lee Chuck. Fong then turns around and seeks out Officer Martin. So this is the officer that Lee Chuck actually tried to shoot, and offers him the same $400 bribe to perjure himself in court to save Lee Chuck from any jail time. So this is important at this time, just to put this in perspective, is at the time, in 2018 today, the average police officer in San Francisco makes somewhere in the neighborhood of $97,000. In 1886, that salary is around $1.62 a day.
So $400, that's with today's money, and the $1.62 a day, that's over a full year's salary.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
Right. So with Martin, it's what we are going to know. Martin seems like to be like this time Serpico.
Yeah, because Martin does turn Fong down,
right,
and says, "No, I'm fine." He actually turns around and then turns Fong Ching into the grand jury. So Fong Ching starts out with saying, "I need you to help out my friend. Here's $11,000."
Right, the guy that just tried to shoot you.
And I think that in itself shows the level of hubris that Fong Ching has.
Right,
I am above the law. Do you know who I am? Here, take this money and keep your mouth shut. Martin, like you said, is Serpico, turns around, turns him into the grand jury, and Fong Ching's actually going to be arrested. Now, he's indicted by the grand jury on charges of attempted bribery of police officers. So he's actually indicted in all of 3 attempts at bribing police officers.
Mm-hmm.
Fong Ching's actually going to hire an army of lawyers, and he's eventually going to be granted bail of $2,000. So again, remember, this is $2,000 in 1886 money. And the lawyers are like the dream team of lawyers for the 1880s. In fact, a few of these lawyers are going to go on to make some pretty big law in San Francisco.
So they're white lawyers.
Yeah, they're white lawyers.
Okay.
They're all white, educated. And again, this I think shows the political savviness of Fong Ching, knowing that as a Chinese immigrant into California, there is no way he's going to get a fair trial. Now, put aside the fact that he's totally guilty and a criminal, but he has the thing where, like, I need somebody that can speak in the courts, so he's going to hire the best lawyers he can find.
Now, 2 things. Were there Chinese lawyers? And if there were, would they be allowed in California courts?
No, actually, there are no Chinese lawyers.
Okay.
There are no Chinese lawyers in white courts.
Okay.
There are Chinese advocates in the 6 company courts. Now, remember, that was the courts that the 6 company set up in Chinatown.
Right.
But the grand jury is San Francisco. In fact, there are some rules saying that Chinese cannot testify in court.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were allowed to testify in court, if you remember the Emma Ledoux case that Jessica covered, Emma Ledoux actually had Asian witnesses that were testifying on her behalf. But because of the fact that they were Asian, their testimony wasn't given the same weight that testimony from white witnesses was given.
Right.
This is where we get into Fong Ching's complete disconnect with the rest of the way things are supposed to work. Now, he instructs his lawyers that his defense is going to be that he did in fact bribe the 2 police officers, but they took it, so it was totally fine. In fact, he's quoted as saying, and I'm quoting here, "Gentlemen, you are not as well acquainted with the police department as I am. They have been blackmailing every Chinaman in Chinatown for years, and it is not a question of right or wrong with them. It is a question of how much," unquote. Now, he would convince his lawyers to go with this defense. I mean, he was paying the bills after all. And I think that this says a lot about the state of graft and corruption that was common in San Francisco at the time.
What is graft?
Graft is like bribery.
Oh, okay.
And like crooked lawyers and crooked cops. And it was everywhere in San Francisco. In fact, the police department themselves have kind of a hands-off policy when it comes to Chinatown. As long as it happens in Chinatown and it doesn't affect everyone else, it's totally okay.
Okay.
And a lot of that has to do because not only the 6 companies, but the Tongs and a lot of these criminal overlords or underworld mob bosses, they're paying off police. They're paying off judges. They're paying off political bosses and high-ranking officials.
Yeah.
So, and again, the fact that somebody would go into court and say, yeah, I actually did what I'm convicted of,
right,
but it's totally cool because they took the money.
Yeah.
Now, this was more of a way of life, and a lot of the powerful people that were not allowed the same protections as those in larger communities outside of the confines of DuPont Guy. So, for a lot of the powerful Chinese that lived in Chinatown, that was just a fact that, like, this is how we do business. We pay off the cops, we pay off the politicians, we pay off the white business owners to leave us alone. This is also explains by the treatment of the Chinese in the court systems in the United States. Again, in a lot of cases, they're not allowed to bear witness against anyone white. Or if they were allowed to present testimony, then Most often, their evidence was not measured equally to those presented by white defendants or witnesses. Again, i.e. the Emma LeDoux case is an example of that.
Right.
I think we'll stop here for this evening. I want to thank you guys for listening to the first part of the life and death of Fong Little Pete Ching and the Tong Wars of the 19th century in San Francisco. I'd also like to thank Sean for talking with me tonight.
Thank you.
And we'll expect you back next week to listen to part 2. We'd also like to remind you to please follow us on the social media at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, don't forget we do have a Patreon page set up, so go there and check it out. And you can visit us at californiatruecrime.com. Please leave us a review in your favorite podcasting app, as well as drop us a line at calitruecrime@gmail.com, where you can let us know how we're doing if you have questions or just want to chat. Again, thank you very much for listening. We'd like to also thank Melanie Duncan, our quality control engineer. This podcast was produced and edited at Chateau Walnut Studios.